Hi. So have you done hand sewing before or just basics?
Yeah. So my experience, are you asking my experience with sewing?
Yeah.
So I mostly do machine sewing. I make garb and like weapon covers and shield covers and stuff. However, I don't do very much hand sewing. I have tried like embroidery projects before, but I don't really finish them. Or like other than like stitching on a button or like maybe fixing seam if I needed to, but not much.
Cool.
So I don't have too much experience in hand sewing. I used to very regularly bring emergency sewing kits to Belagarth events for my friends so I can fix their buttons or whatever. I don't normally enjoy it because it feels very difficult, so I'm hoping to learn some tips and tricks.
Cool. My roommate's cat really enjoys watching hand sewing projects, so she's gonna go in and out of the background. So I was trying to like tucker her out a little bit beforehand. But yeah, so I was gonna start with kind of going over basics of different threads. But if you guys already know machine sewing, you're pretty familiar with all of them. I just grabbed a bunch of random different threads that I had around, like the different embroidery flosses for like floss versus the kind of more woven embroidery cords. And then just things to look out for when you were buying hand sewing thread, just to avoid the like random shiny, like stretchy threads that will break in 2 seconds. And then just other hand sewing thread. And then, are you guys familiar with silamite at all? I know Sita really loves it, so.
I don't know.
Okay, so it's a pre-waxed hand sewing thread. So it comes in a container. It looks like this. So what you do is you break off the bottom and then cut through the loops because they just loop it around a bunch of times, and then you get all these loose ends, which the kitten very much enjoys, so I keep them kind of hidden in here. But it's pre-cut. Once you've cut it, it's really easy to just pull out a length. It's kind of a really convenient length for hand sewing too, so whoever invented the casing thought about it for a while. But it's really nice because it's pre-waxed, so all of the threads, they're usually a cotton or like a cotton nylon blend. Does not say on it at the moment. But it's really convenient because it's pre-waxed already, so you don't have to individually wax your sewing threads, and it makes it a lot harder for it to tangle when you're sewing, which is one of the biggest issues I have, at least with hand sewing without it. You can always buy a wax puck. If you've ever been in Joann's, like in the back corner, sometimes they'll have like a little wax brick or like a circle thing. You use that for waxing hand sewing thread anyway, so you can take regular thread and like run it through the wax puck a couple times, and it'll do the same thing. This one's just already done for you, so you don't have to do it every time. They're usually not very expensive either. I got these from Rowley, and they shipped them to me during quarantine, so it was pretty great. I like hand sewing this stuff because, like I said, it doesn't tangle as easily. It's pretty sturdy. You don't have to worry about like this is the shitty thread that I grabbed, but like this will break sometimes. This I haven't had break on. Hello, hi. I haven't had break on me unless I was sewing through like leather or something, so it's not really up to leather standards, but for any other regular hand sewing projects, it's great. It comes in lots of colors of the, yes. Question?
Does it leave like a residue? Is there a time where I shouldn't be using waxed thread?
No, not really. So you actually, if you like run your hand across it, it's such a thin coating, because it's like, imagine taking your hand sewing thread and like holding it to a bar of soap and going like this through it. It's a really thin coating, and it's not going to prevent all tangles. It just makes it a little bit sturdier and a little bit slippier, but no. When I worked at Universal, the costume shop manager didn't like silamide. So we didn't use it because she thought that the knots came undone easier. But it's really like, as long as you like actually tie your knots tightly, there really isn't an issue. I've personally never had an issue with it. Like if you do yank on it, it will eventually break. It will eventually, like the knots may come out a hint easier, but as long as you're careful with your sewing, there's really no downside to using it. It doesn't come in as a wide variety of colors. It comes in like black, white, all the neutral tones you can think of in between. I have seen it in like a fire truck red, so it does come in other options, but mostly the drawback is just you can't get like random purple tones out of it as easily, and it's not sold in every Joann's. Yeah, there's never really, like the wax, there's not enough wax for it to melt and damage anything unless you're maybe working with some sort of really fancy silk or like a chiffon, since it is a little bit heavier than a regular thread. So at that point, you might want to, but at that point, you're also going to be seeing your seams through it anyway, so it's kind of a dealer's choice. But it's pretty great for everything in your random, normal hand sewing needs. I also like it because the ends, you don't have to lick, like the ends don't fray out as much either. So when you're going to sew your, thread your needle, it's a lot easier to just thread through the eye. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it doesn't, like you don't have to like lick the end of the thread or anything most of the time. Sometimes yes, but not as much. Hi, Iguana, welcome. Let me know if you have any questions. I have the chat open, so if you guys want to chat your questions, I will be keeping an eye on that as well. But yeah, so threading a needle is pretty simple. You just, I tried to grab the biggest eye needle that I had. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's almost an embroidery needle. Maple, do not eat the thread. I have my kitten assistant who's trying to eat the sewing thread as I talk. So needles, you can get them in a pack like this. You get them in pretty much every sewing kit at Ralph's or CVS or whatever. There's not a whole lot you need to worry about with needles unless you're doing specialized projects. Like I don't even remember when I bought this. There are 25 needles in here. They come with assorted eye sizes is the most common thing you'll look out for. Like a really cheap sewing kit at CVS probably won't have really any difference, but if you get the slightly larger packs, most of what it is they'll give you an assortment of, yeah, like that. You'll get an assortment of length and you'll get an assortment of eye size. So you can tell that this needle, hopefully, so there's this needle is relatively large. It's almost an embroidery thread needle, or there's really thin needles. So like you can see the difference here. There's ones that are thinner. It's just smaller. It's easier to use for delicate projects because it's a little bit thinner, but you can basically use any needle you want. It's mostly personal preference. That being said, there are a few special types of needles you can buy. There are obviously leather needles, which are very sharp and very sturdy. There's a kind called sharps, which if you do buy them, I really like them because I like sewing with really tiny needles, just as a personal preference thing. I don't know why. But sharps, if you do buy them, they are very sharp, and the back end where the eye of the needle is will occasionally stab you because they're just very thin, very pointy on both ends. So just as a caveat, if you do buy those, it'll say it on the package, but if you do buy those, be careful when you're pushing your needle through. There's also curved needles, which are mostly used for upholstery sewing, and they can be used for heavier projects. So leather needles come in a curved format as well, but if you're just sewing garb or repairing things, whatever needle came in your sewing kit or this thing will work just fine. All you really need is an eye to hold the thread. And yeah, there are also most basic sewing kits will come with a needle threader. It's the thing that looks like a little tin circle with a diamond of wire coming out of it. I could not find any because I have not bought a sewing kit in probably 5 years. Yes?
What was it called one more time? Maybe we have one.
Needle, it's just a threading tool. They come in the really inexpensive sewing kits, generally like the ones you can find at Ralph's. But it looks like a little tin silver coin with a diamond coming off of it.
I'm pretty sure we have plenty, but the problem that I have is they're so delicate that they break very easily.
Yeah, but what they do is if you're having trouble threading the eye of your needle, you can push the diamond through the eye of the needle, put the thread through the diamond and pull it back through and it'll thread your needle for you. My issue with that, aside from them being relatively fragile, is that you now have to fit 2 widths of the thread plus the 2 widths of that metal that you have through the eye of the needle. So if your issue is you're trying to fit a thicker thread through a smaller eye, even though it's way easier to fit the thread through the diamond of metal than through the eye of the needle, you now have to fit so much more through the eye of the needle. So it doesn't always work, which is why I don't even know where any would be in this house. So they work sometimes, like if you have shaky hands or if you have an issue threading your needle, definitely try them out. But in the long run, it'll be easier if you figure out your own way to thread a needle. Now, once you have your needle threaded, to do that, you take one end of your thread, thread it through the eye and pull it. So you've got 2 lengths of thread. There are a couple different ways to prepare the thread to start sewing. There's the standard way where you just have a short tail and then a longer tail, and you put the end at the longer tail, and that's going to give you 1 length of thread. You just sew, you pull it through until the knot catches in whatever you're sewing, and you keep going. Another way to do it, to kind of, if you've ever heard someone say to double up on your sewing thread, what they can mean is either A, you can put 2 threads through your needle and you can put multiple threads through the eye of the needle, one of the benefits of the larger eyes. Or what you can do to double your sewing thread and to prevent from accidentally letting the tail slip through the needle, what you can do is make both ends of your thread the same length. So I know you can't really see the thread, but they're both the same length now. And if you tie them together into a knot, now A, your needle can't accidentally slip out from the hand sewing thread, so it's a lot harder to lose your needle. It's a lot harder to lose your thread. But B, now you're gonna have 2 threads through every stitch, so it's gonna be a little bit sturdier. This means if you're sewing with Silamide, you get half the length before you have to rethread your needle again. But if you want to do that and you're using a regular hand sewing thread of any kind, what you can do is you can just make it doubly as long as you normally would, and then you can tie it. This trick is really great for sewing buttons. And sometimes what people will do is they'll still put 2 threads through the eye of the needle and you'll tie them both together at the end. So you'll essentially have 4. And that means especially if you're doing buttons, you don't have to go through as many times because you're essentially getting double, or in that case, quadruple the amount of stitches with less work. So I'm gonna start sewing with them together like this, just so I don't lose them. But the other reason I really like this is you can't lose your needle. So if I'm going to an event or if I'm working on something where I have to move around a lot, I'll always stitch it like this, even if I don't need the extra sturdiness, because then if I have to put it down, if I have to go somewhere, if I have to put it in my bag and not look at it again for hours, weeks, whatever, the needle will still be attached to the project and I won't accidentally drop it, and therefore I won't step on it. Because that hurts a lot. So there are lots of ways to tie the thread. My favorite trick I learned at my undergrad. So there's the normal way where you can just tie a knot in your thread like a shoelace, like anything else. The trick that I learned in school, which I think is the best thing on the planet, is you take the thread and in your whatever hand, your dominant hand, you put the end of the thread on your index finger and then you use the needle to hold it. So let's see if you can kind of see. So I have the only point that I'm holding the thread is I'm using the needle to push the thread into my index finger. And then what you're gonna do from there is you're gonna wrap the thread around the needle somewhere between 2 to 5 times. I'm paranoid and I usually do 3 to 4. 2 is generally fine. If you're working on something heavy duty, 5 is great. Or if you're working with like a loosely woven fabric where you need more bulk in that original knot, 4 is also great for that. 4 or 5 is great for that. So you're gonna just twirl it around the needle a couple times. So there's a bunch of loops pressed around the needle against your finger. And then what you're gonna do is you're going to pinch that whole thing between your index finger and your thumb, and then holding tension on that, you're going to pull the needle through and keeping your fingers pinched, and sorry, nails, it doesn't usually snap away, but what happens is you get a really, this is kind of an ugly one because I made it so big, but you get a really sturdy knot at the end, and it's great. Another way, my grandmother's favorite way, was you take the end of your thing, I just cut the knot off for ease of visuals, but you can take the thread, again, pinch it, you can do it around your finger, again, somewhere between 2 and 5 times, depending on how bulky you want it, and then you just kind of wiggle this together until it rolls off of your finger, and again, pinch and pull. These knots are gonna be less pretty. They don't always work, which is why I like the first method the best, but if that doesn't compute, which it just for some reason doesn't click with some people, this way also works great. You occasionally do have to trim a little bit off, but it works just fine. Or you can always, again, tie a knot in it any way you've ever tied knots in string. But this way is the first way I showed you is the fastest, and it's the most stable I've ever found. So if you have a preference on your way, feel free to do that. But does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone have any questions about that? Yes.
Okay, so I got my knots. My knot is right here.
Okay.
That's not right? Where's my supposed to be? Is it supposed to be here, or is it supposed to be at the end here?
It's supposed to be at the end.
At the end of like where the eye of the needle is, or at the very end?
So the opposite end from your needle, at the cut end of your thread.
Okay, I'm gonna try again. Okay. Well, I guess I don't really need to. So I'm looping it 1, 2, wait, so
you've got the end of your thread pinched with the sewing needle, and you're taking the tail end again. So this is your needle end, this is the tail of the thread, the opposite.
Needle, tail, okay.
You've got the tail end pinched with your finger, and then you're gonna take the trail from the tail end and wrap that around. So you've got the tail end here, and then the thread that's coming out of the eye of the needle is not. It's loose over here. So then what you do is you push that through, and while holding those tail loops, you're going to essentially pull it through and have those loops turn into knots.
I'm really not doing a good job here.
And I apologize, this is way easier to see in person when instead of having a camera try and pick up thread.
Okay, thank you.
A good way to check, especially if you're doing the double knotted, is if your knots are secure. If you're ever worried that the waxed thread will come undone, is you just pull the 2 sides apart, and then if the knot stays, it's fine, and it's not going anywhere. Okay, so then I tried to pick the most obvious patterns I had available at the time. So when you're sewing, you generally want your thread to match the fabric as closely as you can. I did not do that in the hope that it would make it easier for the camera to pick up the stitches. So I picked pink bunny fabric. But whatever you're sewing, match it as close as you can. There's a lot of, if you have thread that does not match your fabric whatsoever, there are a couple stitches that are invisible or they aren't seen on the front of the fabric very much, so you can use those. In contrast to that, there are also stitches where you're gonna see the seam, but it's gonna be real sturdy. So it's just kind of your preference of which of those stitches you want. So there are a couple basic stitches to start with. I had to look up the names of them because I don't ever call them by their names. Side effect of your grandmother teaching you to hand sew and your dad, names don't really matter. Also, depending on who you ask, all the names will be different. So call things whatever you want that makes your brain remember them. You will be able to figure it out if you're talking to someone who's professionally in the industry, or if not, you pointed it and then we go, oh yeah, that one, I call it this. So the basic hand sewing stitch is called a running stitch. It's what a sewing machine does. So what you do is you take your thread with your knot and you take your needle from the wrong side of the fabric, which I should actually now mention. So first off, right side and wrong side of the fabric. Right side of the fabric has the pattern. Wrong side of the fabric looks weird and faded. There are some fabrics that don't have right side and wrong sides. There are some fabrics that have directions. That's more for machine sewing, and I'm not going to get into that as much. But for today, right side of the fabric has a pattern. Wrong side of the fabric doesn't look correct. If you don't have any preference one way or another, doesn't matter. But for the purpose of this, I'm going to pretend whatever I'm making with this, you want to see the right side, you don't want to see the wrong side. So you take your needle, you start on the wrong side of the fabric and come up until the knot catches. That means the knot is going to be on the wrong side of the fabric where you don't see it. If you're working on an actual project, like if you've gotten a tear in something, I really like hiding knots inside seams, behind bulkinesses that you're going to not notice as much. It gives it a little bit more structural support, and it makes it a little less annoying for when you're trying to wear this or hide this seam. So a running stitch is the same as a machine stitch, but you start on the back side of the fabric, come out. Once your knot is there, then you're going to go back into the fabric, and then you're going to come back out of the fabric, and you just repeat endlessly. And I'm making these very large so you can see it, but it looks like this, where there is a gap between the stitches. So this is called a running stitch. If it's really large, sometimes it's called a basting stitch, because you're basting fabric. Basting stitch is meant as a temporary support, whereas a running stitch is kind of a regular, everyday sewing stitch. It's going to hold two pieces of fabric together. The smaller your stitches are, the more structural support there will be. The difference between a basting stitch and a running stitch is just size and structural support. Yeah, so this is a running stitch. If you want to hold things together, it'll work fine. It won't be very sturdy. There's a lot of movement, as you can tell. Like if you pull it taut, you can use it to gather fabric, which will get puckered like this. So if you're trying to gather something, it's going to work great. But if you're trying to do a structurally sound something, it's not going to be your best bet, but it is very fast. So if you need something done as quickly as possible, it's fine. The next stitch is called a back stitch. And so it's almost the same motion as this, but instead of going, so you take your next stitch out of the fabric and you've got this gap here between where the thread is coming out and the end of the previous stitch. Instead of going forward and going down in the fabric, what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle and put it through roughly the same hole where the previous stitch went into the fabric. So you sew like this. And see how it doesn't have a gap between the stitches here, where this one does? That's the difference between a back stitch and a running stitch. So a running stitch, you have gaps between the stitches that are visible, whereas a back stitch, you don't. I'm gonna do a couple more of these. So again, you go forward, you come up the right side of the fabric, you go down where the previous stitch went down, and I'm gonna show you the back in just a second, so it looks a little bit different. And please stop me if I'm going too fast. If anybody has questions, I can go slower. I can go faster if people need me to, if I'm going into too much detail. But so, like I said, a running stitch looks kind of like this, where you don't have those gaps between the stitches. And that's what the front side of the fabric will look like. But the back side of the fabric is going to look like this, because you're doubling up on where the thread is going. So you're going to get these images where it's looking like you're overlapping thread in the back. So this can be used as a decorative stitch to create a line of stitching. In embroidery, it looks pretty cool, but it's also going to be more of a sturdy seam, because if you want to pull the thread, you're going to have to place it a bit more forward. Okay. Yeah, so it's going to be like this. This is a little bit sturdier because whereas in the running stitch, this can slide a lot between the fabric. You can't slide as much here because it's got more tension holding it. Awesome. Yeah. Does this help for visuals at all? Hopefully. Okay. So also the neater you, trying to phrase this, sorry. If you go into the stitches you did before, the closer to those original puncture marks you are, the neater it's going to look. And it's going to be a little bit more sturdy, but it's mostly an aesthetic thing for the neatness for that, where so if you miss going in that exact hole, it doesn't matter that much. Next stitch. Okay, so those are going to be your kind of basic straight line stitches. You're just trying to hold two things together. Generally, you do this with a second fabric, and it'll create a seam for you. It also, like I said, can be used as a decoration or to add structural support to something. The next stitches that I'm going to show you are for seams. So I'm going to actually cut this thread here. So if you use the back stitch, you can sew a seam together. You can do anything like that, but see, sometimes you do miss the knots when you're not paying attention. The next stitches I'm going to show you are more for holding two fabrics together, for folding fabrics and stuff like that. So because I want it to be more visible, I'm going to continue using the pink fabric. I'm just going to fold it over. I'm going to use my nails to kind of sheet iron it. So I have a sturdy crease here. So I'm doing this just so you guys can see to create a hemline. So pretend this is the top of the garment up here, and I'm trying to take this raw edge and bind it off is what this is kind of useful for. So the two stitches with this are, the first is called a catch stitch, or sorry, the first is called a whip stitch. That's probably the easiest. So I did not fold this with the direction of the fabric. It doesn't really matter, but what you're gonna do is you're gonna take, if we're gonna say this is the front of the fabric for the moment, if the hem is hiding behind. So you're gonna take your thread, and I like hiding it in whatever thing you're binding off, but you can hide your knot however you prefer. But so for a whip stitch, what you're gonna do is you've sunk your needle, your knot in your thread, so the knot in your thread in your fabric, sorry. So it's it's taut. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna take, on the sides of the raw edge, you're gonna go into the fabric on one side of the cut edge that you're trying to bind and come up to the other side. Look kind of like this. I'm gonna do another couple stitches so you guys can see what it looks like. But you're just essentially going in and out of the fabric, and instead of going in and out in a line, you're going in and out of the fabric across whatever you're trying to hold down. So I did a couple more, and it's gonna look like this. So I'm whip stitching this raw edge to this fabric, and that's gonna hold this fold in place. It's gonna hold this hem in place. The outside of the fabric is gonna look like this. So you will see these stitches, is the caveat to this. You can use them as decoration, or you can, like I said, try and match the fabrics. I'm trying to use as contrasting as I had accessible. So you see the stitches pretty easily, but you can hide them, and you can do larger stitches if it's not gonna hold a lot of tension, which will look, if I cannot catch my fabric. Like you can do big stitches, you can do small stitches. It's just about the amount of structural support you want. Generally, smaller stitches are more structurally sound. Bigger stitches have more wiggle room. So this is great if you want a relatively solid hold on whatever you're sewing over like this. The next stitch is a catch stitch. You'll usually see this at the bottom of pants. If you've ever looked at the bottom of suit pants and you see little X's of thread, that's what this is for. This next stitch is supposed to be, is less visible and therefore a little bit less sturdy, but if you really want the outside of your garment to look clean, that's what this is used for. So we still have this folded over edge as if we're hemming it. And what we're gonna do is, sounds weird, but you're gonna take your needle and point it away from the way you're sewing. So if I'm sewing this way across my fabric, I want the point of the needle going this way. And so what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the point of your needle, take a couple of threads, and pull it toward you in the face fabric. And again, you're gonna do on this top fabric that's looped over, you can catch more things. This is where most of your structural stability will be. You're gonna, again, pull it towards you. Even though you're moving your seam farther that way, the needle is always going to move in this direction. So again, take a small pinch out of the bottom fabric that you can see from the outside, and then take a bigger pinch of the top fabric that you won't be able to see. And so what this is gonna do is, you can tell from the fabric here, it's going to untangle things, have a lot less show through than these bigger stitches here. And it'll also, from this side, give you a little bit more movement between this in this seam. So even though the seam is anchored here, it's going to have a little bit more movement side to side, a little bit more movement up and down, because these X's are going to have a little bit more leeway with the movement of the stitches. And that's called a catch stitch. Another stitch that I can show you is, I'm going to fold this again for the point of this. So this stitch is called a blanket stitch. My dad taught it to me when I was a kid, so I had a different name for it. So I never call it a blanket stitch, but this is the most sturdy stitch that I can teach you. This is really great for repairs or for binding edges. So I just folded this rectangle again like this. So we're gonna bind off this edge here. And so instead of going through fabric this way and trying to catch both sides of it and crossing over the gap, what we're gonna do is we're actually going to go similar motion, but we're gonna go through. And then, so you go through the fabric and you've got this loop at the end, and you're gonna take the needle back through the loop and pull it taut. So again, that's, you go from one side of this to the other, and then before your thread gets pulled taut, you take your needle through it, and then you pull it tight. So what's gonna happen, do one more so you can see it, is you're gonna be binding this thread along the edge here. So instead of having these gaps from our earlier stitches where you have thread and raw fabric going through, you're gonna bind it off with the thread, and that thread's gonna protect your raw edges. You can also tell as I try and flatten it out, because of the way we're stitching it, this thread is going to be, held up. I don't think thread. Just tighten those back up, sorry. So whereas these, when we were stitching flat, you can lay the fabric flat. This fabric, you can't really lay flat anymore. It's got a pucker in it from this side, but now you've got all of this fabric holding the strength of the seam together as well. If you're doing this without catching the loop of the fabric, it's still considered a whip stitch, even if you're doing it on the edge. So if you're just doing this without catching those loops, this is what it looks like without catching them. So it's still going to hold the edges of the fabric together. It's still going to be a relatively sturdy seam, but it's not as strong as the blanket stitch. And it's not going to protect the edges as well. So this is something that you can use, A, when you're repairing a rip in something, But also if you're trying to bind the edge on the inner seam of like a shirt or something because the fabric's itching you or it keeps trying to fray or whatever it is, the blanket stitch will just create a really solid, sturdy seam. The last stitch I'm going to show you is called an invisible stitch. And so again, you're taking the fabric here, and what you're going to do is, I'm going to create a loop here, so I start in the right thing. So what you're going to do is you're going to come, so you've got this opening here, and you're going to take your needle and you're going to go through, help if I was pointing in the right direction, you're going to go through a very, very tiny amount of the outer fabric. At some points, like if you're doing like a really thin silk chiffon or something, you can go through 1 or 2 threads and grab that from that side. And you're going to do it really close to the top edge. And you're going to go through the other side and do the same thing. Grab a couple of stitch threads and pull that through. I should preface, you should not be doing this against the raw edge of a fabric, I realize. This is going to be here. Actually, let me show this to you on the other fabrics. I'm going to do it this way. So what you're going to do is if you have 2 fabrics, you're going to either take your 2 fabrics and press them against each other, or if you're working from one thing of fabric, you're going to take both ends of it and press them together like this. And so you're going to actually be sewing between these 2 edges here. This is one time when you may not want to have your 2 threads tied together at the end, because the less thread you have, the easier it's going to be to hide. So I'm going to take these 2, and starting at whichever edge you prefer, you take your needle through from the back end of the fabric, and you're going to just pinch a couple threads from the one side, and you're going to try and hold your fabric next to each other if possible, because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be just grabbing a couple threads from each side of this gap, and you want to make them parallel to each other. So it's like the running stitch I showed you at the beginning, where you're going to have gaps between your stitches. But what happens is it kind of pull this. So between the 2 threads or the 2 fabrics, it kind of looks like this if you don't pull the stitches tight. So they have gaps between them. But when you pull the thread taut, you have this seam where you can't see the stitches from the outside. If you turn your garment right side out, pull on the thread here, you still can't see those stitches that are holding it together. This is really great on putting things together, like pillows is the first time I ever had to use this, where if you've stuffed the thing, or if you're making rocks or other weapons that you've stuffed the thing, you've put everything inside it, and now you just need to do up that last little bit of the project without ugly stitches looking at the top. Because again, you can always whip stitch across the top. It'll be super sturdy, it'll be done. But the invisible stitch will make it so you don't see any of that stitching, and it'll just bind everything together really cleanly. You can still do it from the right sides. So instead of coming into your fabric, you're going to sit on top of your fabric and just take little pinches of it from each side until you have whatever you need closed. And it's just really pretty because, like I said, and so you just can't see all of the stitches. Does anybody have any questions about any of those? I know I ran through them super fast. Yes, Pet?
Hey, I have a couple things to say. The first is, unfortunately, my tablet is dying faster than it is charging. So I apologize in advance if it dies probably within the next like 10-15 minutes, and not your whole thing is on video. But I do want to see that invisible stitch just one more time.
Yeah, let me just
closer to the camera.
Yeah. Okay. I ran out of thread, so I'm going to really quickly rethread my needle. So one of the reasons it probably looked a little wonky when I was doing it is there's a lot of different ways to come at an invisible stitch, and it entirely depends on what situation you're in, because you can use it for pretty much anything that you want to look really clean. But it's generally done in situations where you can't get kind of that ideal angle on something. So I'm going to pin this together, just So I pinned this end together to pretend that this seam is kind of done. Because generally when you're doing an invisible stitch, like I said, you're kind of just stuck. Everything else is finished on your project. This is all you have left. You just need this to not be a gaping hole anymore. So what you do is, whenever possible, you hide your knot. Just gonna come through here. A lot of times you'll be holding it kind of like this to make sure that your project is staying together where you want it to. And what you're gonna do is, so I came out this side of the fabric, I don't know what side, but this side of the fabric for you guys, and I'm gonna pinch from this side, just go up and grab a couple of threads just inside the opening. So if this is the top edge of the fabric where I want the seam to look, I'm gonna put my needle through, let's see, you can see it, just a hair below the top of that seam, where I want that seam to lay. And again, pull that out, and then I'm gonna go through the opposite side of the fabric. So I just came out of this side, sorry, I just came out of this side of the fabric, now I'm gonna go through this side of the fabric. And again, I'm going to take just a couple threads. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna not pull these taut so you guys can see kind of the sewing pattern. Just a second. Okay. So yeah, so it's gonna kind of look like this on the inside, where there's just, sometimes this is called a ladder stitch because you're gonna see little threads coming across your opening. But from here, when you pull the fabric taut, or the thread taut, you're really not gonna see as many stitches. I messed up a little bit, so you do see a bit of thread on the outside, but just the more you practice, the easier to hide them, and you take smaller and smaller stitches. And again, using a non-sharply contrasting thread will help with that. Yeah, this is purely for an aesthetic choice. This is not gonna be your sturdiest stitch, but it looks really nice because you don't see the stitching as much. Did that answer everybody's question, or do you want me to go through it one more time? Okay, cool. So the final thing I was gonna show you guys were buttons, because those fall off all the time and are super annoying. So there's a couple different types of buttons. There's what I consider a regular button. So it's just got some holes in it. These are clear, so you could kind of see what I was gonna do with stitching, but these are your regular buttons. I don't know if they have a special name, but where the holes go through the top of the button and out the bottom. The other kind of a button is called a shank button. So they kind of look like this, where this is the front of the button. This usually happens in like fancy coats where you've got the front of the button that looks either like a military button, fabric, whatever it is, but then instead of having visible holes on the bottom, you have these metal protrusions that kind of stick up. And those are the shank of a button. So you're gonna sew through these instead of through holes that go through the top of the button. You can turn these into shank buttons, like the regular style buttons, into shank buttons, depending on how you sew them. But it all depends on the type of closure you want. But generally, you're going to have a button that has fallen off of something that you need to reattach, and then it's easier. Yes, Pet, what was your question?
So in my personal experience, the ones that you don't sew all the way through tend to be really flimsy. So is it just inherently not as sturdy, or is there
buttons?
Yeah.
It depends. Do you mean like the buttons fall off easier?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes they do. A lot of it depends on how they're sewn, and I would definitely agree with you that like on ready-made like fashion stuff, like things you find at Target, these are definitely going to be less sturdy because I don't know if they can do it by machine, but it's definitely not as well sewn on. But if you're sewing them on by hand, you can make these at least roughly as sturdy as the other ones. But these are also going to come in contact with a lot more issues. So like this is going to be sitting up off of the top of your fabric. And so if you brush something, this is going to get pulled. Also, a lot of the times the inside of a shank button will have a sharper metal edge from where like a nail has been pushed through to create these holes. And so that's going to put a lot more tension on the thread you're using. But if you're using a shank, I couldn't find one of the regular ones, but there's a lot of shank buttons, like a lot of the military buttons will have like a metal loop on it. And those don't have the sharp edges issue, but the shank buttons are just gonna come in with a lot more contact. So if you're using a regular button, that's gonna sit pretty flush with whatever garment it's on, so it's just not gonna get jostled around as much. But if you're hand sewing, you can make them relatively sturdy, the same amount. But on fashion clothes, like if things from Hot Topic, these will fall off within your first week. Like if you buy sweaters with this, I usually I'll buy them and I'll go home and I'll like pull on all of them, and half the time one of them will fall off and I'll immediately resew it back on because I've lost a lot of these. But that's just a fashion thing. Like you can get a machine to sew through these if you need to, whereas these I don't think you can to the same extent, so they just are not done well in modern clothing. But that you can make them sturdy. They look really cool. They're great for accents, and you can make them equally sturdy if you sew them yourself. For buttons, I really like the Silamide thread, as I mentioned before at the beginning. But even if you're using a regular hand sewing thread, or if you're using like an embroidery thread or a really heavyweight machine sewing thread, I still suggest, as I lose my needle, putting the thread through a couple of times, because it's just going to make your life easier and it's going to make your job go by way faster. Because if you put 4 threads through, you only have to do 1 or 2 stitches per side. But with buttons, because I'm almost out of time, you're going to go up through the fabric, up through the button, down through the fabric, or down through the button, down through the fabric. I'm going to repeat that a couple times, and that's your basic button. So normally I'd sew it through a couple extra times, but your basic button is going to look like that, where your thread goes through your button, goes through the fabric, comes back out from the other side. You've got the same pattern on the back of whatever you sewed, so it looks the same. That's your standard button. If you take another standard button, you can turn it into a shank button by going through it, like coming out of the fabric, going up through the button. And then when you go back through the button into the fabric, you're gonna not pull it all the way taut. You're gonna leave a little bit of wiggle room for your button. I usually do it by like sitting my thumb partially under the button, but it's gonna just be a little loose. So it kind of wiggles around. It's gonna be a little loose. You again go up through your fabric, down through your button, down through your fabric, just kind of the normal thing you see on TV when everyone sews anything. Just do that a couple times. And then instead of you're gonna go down through the button that last time, and instead of going back into the fabric, what you're gonna do, this is a bad example, but it was clear, so it was gonna be easier for you to see. You're gonna wrap the thread around all of those stitches you've made a few times until you are it has the height you want. And then you go through that fabric. So it's gonna look like this. So you can see there's a bulk of fabric here between where the fabric is and where the button is. It's got that little gap there. And so you've wrapped your fabric around that a bunch of times, and then you're gonna take your needle and go through that bulk of fabric, bulk of thread, sorry, between, and then go back down through your fabric. And I realized I never taught you guys how to knot after you were done sewing. But yeah, I'll show you that in a second. But now your button is turned into a shank button by thread. So it's got that little extra gap. And this is really great if you're trying to get something to close with a sturdy fabric. Now you're gonna have room underneath your button for that fabric to sit. And that's the main purpose of a shank button, is just to give a little extra clearance for whatever you're trying to button onto it to fit. This is great for things like if you have those loops that are like on sleeves, a lot of women's sleeves. If you have those loops, you can wrap them around it and it'll have enough space to hook under something without pulling your fabric to give it that space. And then, because I totally forgot and I apologize, I'm going to show you how to knot your thread off when you're done sewing something, which is a very important part of sewing. So what you're going to do is you're on your back of the fabric, and similarly to the knot I showed you at the beginning, you're going to take your needle, slip it through a little bit of fabric, and have it come up. See, it's sitting like this. It's also like if you're storing your needle, that's what this kind of looks like. So it's part of the way through the fabric. And the same way when I was showing you guys how to do a knot at the beginning, you're going to take it, you're going to take the tail end of the thread that has come up through your fabric from before, not the one that's attached to the needle, but the opposite end of that. You're going to wrap it around the needle 2 to 5 times, depending on how sturdy you want it to be. So you've got it wrapped around the needle. Then you're going to pinch that again and pull it all the way through until you've got it to form a nice little knot at the bottom. If you're paranoid like me, you can then have your needle go through the fabric again as if you're going to do another knot, and you just pull it all the way through. And I like doing that because that traps the tail in whatever you were sewing, so it's not as visible. It gives it a little bit longer, and then when you snip your thread, it's not so close to the knot that it'll slip out of the knot and unravel. And that just hides it nicely and gives it a little extra thread. So I'll do that one more time just so I can go through it again. But if you're ready to knot off your thread, you've come through your fabric. That was your last stitch. You're going to take a little bit of the fabric right around that stitch. So your needle on one end was like, there's a little bit of fabric covering up the middle of your needle. You're going to take the thread that's coming out of your last stitch, wrap it around the point of the needle. So again, the thread that came out of the fabric, sorry, I'm trying to get this visible for you guys. Not this end where it's coming out of the needle, but the end where it came out of the fabric. You're going to pinch that and push the needle all the way through until you have a nice knot in the fabric. And then I'm going to trim your thread, and voila, whatever you were stitching is now knotted and done. Does anyone have any questions? Did I forget anything else that anyone is curious about? I know I said I would be done now, but does anyone have any other questions that they want me to go over? Okay, Squire Pet was wonderful, and on the tablet she recorded this, so if anybody has any questions or if they missed it, they're going to be posting it up on the Andrill YouTube site at some point. And thank you guys for running this and organizing all the tech side of this, because that was definitely the more daunting aspect in my opinion. So thank you guys so much, and thank you everybody who showed up. I hope this helped and was informative.